artificial intelligence will completely transform our world. But what is AI? Why will it affect you? And how can you and your business survive and thrive through the AI revolution? Welcome to AI and You. Here is your host, author, speaker, and futurist, Peter Scott.
Hello and welcome to episode 315. This week we go underwater to talk with whales. No, we're not deconstructing Star Trek 4. There have been some amazing breakthroughs recently in understanding the language of sperm whales, and AI plays a fascinating part in that. And in any case, it was humpback whales in Star Trek. And even if you have no immediate intentions to go say hi to a whale, AI's part in this story has ramifications far outside the field of cetacean communication. Taking us through that is Gašper Beguš, whose recent research has produced one of the most startling advances yet in the quest to understand whale communication. Gašper is Associate Professor of Linguistics at UC Berkeley, where he focuses on interpretable AI, combining linguistics, cognitive science, machine learning, neuroscience, philology, and marine biology. He is the linguistics lead at Project SETI, that's with a C for cetacean, not an S, a non-profit organization applying advanced machine learning and state-of-the-art robotics to understanding whales, working in Dominica in the Eastern Caribbean. In his Berkeley Biological and Artificial Language Lab, he also builds the most realistic models of human language learning. He's been featured everywhere from the BBC and The Guardian to Time, The Atlantic, and National Geographic. We're going to start with a fascinating backgrounder in linguistics, then talk about what's fascinating about whales, comparing them to other vocalizing creatures, talk about communicating with aliens and interspecies communication, what language even means for whales, and the birds and the bees. So let's get into the interview.
Gašper Beguš, welcome to AI and You. And you came to Wales through a journey that included ancient languages, linguistics, and AI. Those are interesting bedfellows. How did you end up studying our cetacean friends?
Well, it's really unusual. And in my undergrad studies, I was really fascinated by languages in general, but especially these old dead languages that have their own writing systems and were written in languages of civilizations that were really quite magnificent, like ancient Greek or Hittite, which is the language of the Hittites kingdom in Anatolia 3,500 years ago. And the story about these dead languages is that people started realizing that they actually are too similar to be coincidental, those similarities. So people started, of course, learning Greek and Latin, but then they went to India and they saw, oh, wow, Sanskrit is so similar to Greek and Latin. How do I make sense of this? And they realized, well, probably they go back to the same common ancestor that perhaps no longer exists. That was the 18th century idea. And then people started taking this idea really seriously, and they realized that languages develop in a regular fashion, right? So I can find laws that will tell me how a Greek or Latin or Hittite or Sanskrit developed from the mother language, which was the Proto-Indo-European language. And for 200 years, the brightest minds in linguistics and mathematics learned about how to reverse engineer the proto-language of these magnificent languages. And this is a really beautiful field, a really exciting field where you take mathematics and you take linguistics and philology. So you have to understand the languages, you have to understand the way how language evolves or develops. You have to understand the properties of language really well so you can reconstruct the proto-language. And that's what linguistics was all about for 200 years. And it's an ancient branch of linguistics. And I studied that as an undergraduate. Now, the switch to whales came later. But the idea is that when you study these languages, you learn a couple of things. One is that you have to get into the mind of this ancient person who wrote a text, right? And it's a really difficult exercise because people were different to some degree back then. And you have to, the texts are ancient and the grammars are difficult. So you spend hours and hours thinking about what was happening in this person's mind when he was composing this hymn or composing this text or writing a letter at 3,500 years ago. And then the other thing is you spend time focusing on details, right? In the age of big data, where we're trying to get this sense of big trends in the world, philology, or the study of ancient languages, teaches you to pay attention to details rather than big trends. And that really helped me then when I started doing AI. A lot of people use AI in order to discover big trends, big data patterns, whereas I was focusing on understanding how AI actually works through these kind of details and mistakes it makes and the wrong forms it makes. And then that's the same as in linguistics, right? We know more about English plural, how it sounded like 1,000 years ago, from the irregular plurals, from ox, oxen, or, mice, louse, lice, than we do from the way we do plurals today. So philology gives you basically two things: the attention to detail and also this exercise in trying to get into the mind of a person who wrote text, who was a human, but lived 3,000 years ago. And that, you can see how that is useful for when you try to understand what these beautiful animals are doing, whales, not 3,500 years ago, but 90 million years of evolution ago, in a sense, when they vocalize in a similar way as us.
Oh, you were talking about getting inside the mind of someone who was writing something ancient just reminded me of this story I saw about a medieval monk illustrating a manuscript who wrote on the page that he was cursing the cat that had come and urinated on his work. And I thought that even then they had the problem of cats walking on the keyboard, as it were. So why whales? You could have had dolphins, you could have songbirds. What is it that turns you on about whales?
Okay, so there's a lot of reasons why whales, or particularly sperm whales, but other cetaceans in general, are really interesting. And all our animals are interesting in their own right. Bees are fascinating, incredible. When you try to decode animal communication system, it's really difficult. It's really hard. It's a tough problem to crack. The way I got into animals is through parrot research. I worked with Irene Pepperberg, who is this amazing pioneer. And she raised this parrot, Alex the parrot, who learned human language and imitated extremely well, and showed through its learned language, its foreign language in a sense, how smart it is and all the cognitive things that we didn't know the parrot could do. So in a sense, the parrots have cracked our code in some sense, and we have yet not done it the opposite. So what you try to do is you try to look at species that have as similar communication system as humans, right? So if you look at primates, right, monkeys, great apes, and so on, a lot of their vocalizations are innate. So they have alarm calls. It's similar to our cries. It's species specific. If you take one individual and raise it in another species, they will still have their own species cries. It's not culturally learned vocalizations. And whales have culturally learned vocalizations. They have dialects. They have the vocalizations change over time, just like our languages change, like from Middle English or Hittite or Proto-Indo-European to today's English, for example. They're incredibly smart. And in some birds, you also have culturally learned vocalizations, but oftentimes it's either in the function of alarm calls or mating. Our cetaceans, our sperm whales, actually converse when they come together and before they hunt and when they socialize. So they have this culturally learned vocalizations that they use in context where you would assume that something meaningful, some transmission of information between individuals is happening. That's really powerful. That's relatively unique already, right? So if you think of dogs, right, they bark at each other from very far, and then when they come together, they smell each other. Whales actually come together and then they start talking. They start exchanging these clicks or groups of clicks that are called codas. And so that's already why I'm fascinating. Now, there's a lot of other reasons as well. One of the predictors of intelligence is how long does a child spend in the childhood with the mother. And for crows, it's 2 years. For chickens, it's 3 weeks. For elephants, it's, 6, 7 years. For sperm whales, it's 13 years. For orcas, it's forever. And so this kind of rich cultural knowledge that can be transmitted through generations of whales can be really fascinating. They have the biggest brain. They have the most neocortex. So all these predictors or things that you might sense some sort of similar intelligence to humans are there. And unlike birds and elephants, it's much, much harder to study them. So we have this wonderful multidisciplinary Project SETI, that is now more than 50 scientists from all over the world, that brings together all the advances in soft robotics, bio-inspired robotics, machine intelligence, linguistics, biology, all these various fields together to listen and really collect data that we didn't really have. So a lot of whales, a lot of things about their lives, a lot of recordings just don't exist. A lot of data is just not there. And we're starting to collect it. And that's another reason why it's exciting, because a lot of this is completely new.
I want to get into this as a journey and unpack it, but I just want to point out I know about Irene Pepperberg very well because we have an African grey who might interrupt at some point. He's off in the distance. And so we know all about Alex here, and I would really encourage listeners to go watch any of the videos and other recordings of Alex that show him speaking, but he's speaking in Irene's voice and really had amazing levels of comprehension. So whale language. Now, I can imagine that if we look at some sequence of sounds in this case, that you could infer that it had a certain amount of structure, entropy in it, but that you might not know what it meant. You could just tell that it was there. And then figuring out what it means comes later. Where are we on that axis?
Right. Well, so when you're faced with an unknown communication system, right, it's kind of a similar problem as if aliens came and, everyone saw the Arrival movie. So how do you make sense of it? And one thing to keep in mind is that you have to figure out what are all the physical properties, what are all the ways that meaning could be transmitted in a system, right? Because if you're not looking at something, you're not going to be able to decode it if you're not even seeing it, right? So first you need to understand what the pieces in the puzzle are. So if you imagine we were, like say aliens came to observe us and we grab coffee somewhere and they see our conversation, and imagine that they wouldn't be able to hear anything we do with our mouth. They would only be able to hear our vocal fold vibration, right? For some reason, their equipment is not good enough. They only really hear our vocal fold vibration, and they don't hear any of the other things that we do when we speak with our mouth.
So tongues, lips, teeth don't count for this.
Let's say they have faulty human recorder that doesn't look at that. Okay. They would see two humans grabbing a coffee and they will hear something like, something like that, right? And they would say, wow, these guys, okay, they have coffee, but we cannot hear anything about coffee. They never talk about coffee. They're just like producing these vocalizations. That's not particularly interesting. They're probably just vocalizing to express their presence, right? So there's nothing really interesting going on there.
Mating calls.
Yeah, something like that, right? So in sperm whales, it was in a sense similar, right? So that they have clicks has long been known. And people thought that they exchanges clicks, and that these clicks work much like a Morse code, right? So the number of clicks matters and the timing between them matters. So if you ever heard a sperm whale clicking, it would be something like they have units of clicks that are called codas. So something like click, 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 click would be a coda, or click, 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 click would be coda. So 5 clicks and then timing, they're differently spaced in time, those clicks. When I started this research, that was the known thing. So what I did was, in my other life as a AI researcher, I developed models like chatbots, but those that learn more like human babies, right? Not from text, not from massive amounts of Wikipedia articles, but from small amount of words that they just hear and they produce, right? Our babies speak all the time. And so they listen, our models listen and speak. And as models, I've had like this whole research program where there's a lot of language that the models learn on their own without being ever taught language explicitly, just like our human babies, right? So we took those models that we've been developing in the lab and said, well, if they're able to learn human language really well, why don't we train the models to imitate, to learn codas, to learn those vocalizations, and then also transmit meaning through them, right? The task of the model that we created was imitate what whales are saying and encode some information. And then we've been developing this kind of neurosurgery methods for the AI models. So it's called AI interpretability, where you kind of open the black box and try to interpret what each neuron inside is doing. And so we were able to do that. And the model suggested that, sure, timing and number of clicks matters, which was the known fact. But it also suggested that spectrum matters. So the way frequencies, the way those individual clicks are actually produced mattered. Now, that was an interesting result. And at the time, I was like, okay, that's interesting. If AI thinks so, let's try to dig a little deeper in that. Now, if you look at those raw clicks, they sound like clicks to us, and they're very slow. And that was the wrong human-centric perspective on this communication system. What you need to do is you understand that those are actually not clicks, they're pulses. So just like when we produce speech, our vocal folds vibrate. Those clicks are actually not clicks, they're vocal fold vibration. And the crucial part in the discovery was that, okay, these are just extremely slow vowels. If you delete all the silences, if you remove all the slowness from their communication system, I realized that there are patterns in the spectrum that perfectly coincide with the traditional coda delineation. So in other words, there are discrete patterns where one coda is either of one type or the other. And that's really interesting because it means that whales probably control that. It's very discrete. It's very symbolic-like. It's very language-like. And I've been working so far with quite a number of animal vocalizations, and I'm always shocked by just how discrete and controlled this whale communication seems. And the only thing the really important thing was just to step out of our humans' perception of timing and understand that these clicks are just very slow vowels.
Well, when you say vowel, that seems unusually anthropocentric.
Right.
And you talking the research about the A vowel and the I vowel, and that's even more anthropocentric. That's Latinate or whatever the term is. How do you arrive at that representation for it?
Right. Well, because when we dig deeper and you realize that, okay, so first, what are vowels, right? So when we say vowels, when we speak in general, we send air through our vocal cords, the thing in the throat. You can put your finger on your throat and you'll feel it vibrates when you speak. Those are vocal fold vibration. That's an organ that is there in order for you to not suffocate when you eat and inhale food, right? So the organ that had a function developed this secondary function for our language. And then on top of that organ, you have a whole air balloon, which is our mouth. And the reason why we can express information and exchange information through spoken language is because I'm changing the shape of that vocal tract pretty fast, right? When you see me speak, you see my lips going up and down, and you see my tongue is doing a lot of heavy lifting. That's me encoding information, me expressing meaning through muscle movements so that the air sac after my vocal folds changes and the spectrum, the frequency, the resonant frequency change. Now, if you look at what in whales it happened is it's basically a case of convergent evolution. Most animals vocalize with this organ that prevents us from suffocating for inhaling food. Not whales. They have not toothed whales. They have developed phonic clips, which is the equivalent of our vocal cords, inside their noses. They have this giant nose complex that acts as a sonar. And then the nice thing I realized is that after those vocal phonic clips, vocal cords, they have an air sac in a very similar way as we're changing our internal air balloon. They have a little air balloon, air sac, that they probably change the shape of in order to get those A and I type vowels. So from the production perspective, this is probably very similar. They have very discrete systems, discretely distributed types. They also have diphthongs. So it's really nicely controlled, repetitive across whales. We've seen now these patterns in numerous whales. And, even when they do birth, they use them. So to answer your first question, that is the first step. We need to uncover all the structured possible ways. We need to find all the sounds that these whales could transmit information through, right? When you write a grammar of human language, you start with phonology. So first you identify which sounds does a language have. Like English doesn't have some sounds that my language, so for example, Slovenian has, and vice versa. So you need to identify sounds. And then so this research uncovered a whole new dimension that we are now can look at. Before we couldn't, because before we were the aliens who could only hear our vocal folds but not our mouth. And now we're hearing more and more, and we're making step-by-step progress to identify all the ways they can communicate with. And that gives you a chance to be better at understanding their meaning. And then you look at, okay, where are they using their vowels? Are there situations where they use one more or the other? And then that's how you're approaching understanding what this communication also actually means.
If only we could have a Rosetta Stone for whales. But that made me wonder, is it possible that other species like dolphins can understand the whales?
That is really excellent question. The research there is only at the beginning. So there is evidence of interspecies communication and even bidirectional, actually. Some of them also involve humans. One of the favorite ones for me is the honey guides in Africa. So there are bird species that help humans find beehives or bees with honey. And in return, they get some of the remains, right? Because the birds themselves could not get the honey, and the humans themselves could not find the honey. And so they have this bidirectional communication, birds and humans. A lot of people have dogs, and we know that in many ways there's communication between dogs and humans. Maybe not in the return. We don't often interpret dogs' barks in that way, but I wouldn't be surprised if at least dolphinids, so their family, they would probably get some from them. Songbirds are also they understand each other's alarm calls. So I think we have this model of the world where we are like, I think the old model was there are species, there are these boxes that we call species. These species has their own thing, they live in their own universe. And I think we're moving towards, we're all part of this big network and we're understanding each other and learning from each other. And I would not be surprised if more and more research suggests that there is, even maybe interspecies communication underwater.
So to get to the question of the structure, can you quantify the level of structure in the language that would relate it to something that we could understand, like reading grade or Flesch-Kincaid level of complexity or anything like that? Could we tell how much sophistication whales can convey?
Right. Yes. So, like you started again, the research started with what is known. It's like this Morse code that maybe there are 27, 25, 40 classes of different vocalizations, and that's it. And then there's research that showed that timing was more complex from our projects, from our colleagues, so that they really pay attention to the timing differences. And that increases the number of classes. And then the vowel, the whole spectrum thing, then that really makes the complexity through the roof. Because if you think of like why our speech is so complex, it's precisely because we combine both our vocal fold vibration information and our air balloon, our vocal tract information, right? So I can vibrate my vocal folds fast or slow. That is tone or pitch. Right? It's the same vowel, but with two different pitches, right? And I can cross that perfectly with different vowels. So I can say e or e. So now I have 4 classes, right? Instead of only 2. So basically you have this kind of 2 independent modules. And not a lot of animals have that. For example, as far as we know, birds only really modulate the fundamental frequency, right? So only really modulate the vocal fold equivalent vibration. Whereas we have these 2 things, and whales have these 2 things as well. So that makes their communication system way more complex than we initially thought. And you can quantify it, with the number of classes and the number of possible discrete classes, right?
So can you look at higher level structures? Because at the phonetic level, I can say the cat sat on the mat, and that's exercising the vocal tract qualities that you talked about. I can exercise a similar number of vocal tract qualities and say ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, and I'm at an entirely different level of abstraction. Are we able to see that level of structure in whale language?
So one thing you have to understand is that we're terrestrial creatures, and there's a lot of things you can test very easily, right? So if you have to learn a new language, even if you don't know that language, first you're sharing all the humanities, you're sharing all the humanity, all the context. And also you can do this kind of experiments to see, okay, if I show somebody an object, how are they going to respond to it? With whales, right? So for this higher level complexity, you need to understand their lives, their ocean, the ocean life, right? And there are concepts in their life that don't exist in humans, human language at all. Or actually, there are concepts in their lives that, there are concepts in our lives that they never see, right? They don't have a tree, they don't have ground, they don't have roads, they don't drink, they don't smell, they only taste, for example. So we share a lot of things with terrestrial animals, and there's a lot of concepts that are very different underwater. And probably the opposite is true as well, right? So there are probably things that are trees, whale trees, that we don't see, right? That we don't perceive, or is not meaningful to us. So it's a really interesting question. What's a tree for a whale? And I think that's a really difficult exercise that we're doing, which is how do I even represent their world so that I could get meaning from it, right? So a light doesn't even travel below 200, 300 meters in the ocean, right? And even then, even higher up, it's kind of murky. So they have echolocation. So they use those clicks also to see in a way, right? To navigate, to understand where they are, where other things are, where orcas are. And so the first step is to really understand how they represent their worlds. And then that's what we're doing with a lot of data and thinking about trying to get inside their, minds. But it's technically, engineering-wise, it's a challenging thing because these whales have 200 plus decibels clicks. And, it's difficult even to create a sonar that would be something like that. And so they're basically sending those clicks in the ocean and listening to what comes back and creating the world around that. And so it's just conceptually very different. Now, there are things that unite us, right? So going back to the analogy with the human who lived 3,500 years ago, there's a lot of in that human's mind that is different from our world now, right? Our mental world now. If you read all the rituals and all the laws that these ancients had, they were very different in many ways. But on many levels, we're very similar to those ancients 3,500 years ago. They had similar problems, they had similar issues, they had similar interpersonal relationships. And whales, there's a lot they unite us between whales as well. One of them is this sense of the family and community. The families speak similar dialects, speak similar language, and there are clans of families that speak similar dialects, right? And that's similar to humans. We use dialects to express where we belong, what our background is, what our geographic background is. They have really, really similar social structures, right? So they have multi-generational societies where grandmothers are around and transmitting cultural knowledge. They have cultures, they have dietary preferences, they have this kind of moral obligations. They babysit each other's calves, for example. We just recorded the birth of a sperm whale where it was a magnificent event. Actually, the baby is not buoyant. And so 11 whales from 2 different families came together to help lift the baby up so that it could breathe. And they're coordinating all of that. And so there are things that unite us. There are these junction points. But also there's a lot that, divides us. The ocean, for example, being a completely different world from terrestrial world. So one has to really kind of step out in order to get to the meaning and complexity, higher level complexity. We first need to understand the ocean better.
That's the end of the first half of the interview. Next half, next week. In today's news ripped from the headlines about AI, I can't believe I am still relaying incidents about lawyers using AI in their court filings without checking the output. But here we are again. And this time, lawyers on both sides of a federal court case in Mississippi used AI. So effectively, the AIs were arguing against each other. Judge Sharion Aycock wrote in a scathing sanctions order, yay, finally, sanctions, that, quote, in an era of rampant unverified AI usage within the legal field, this case presents a prime example of the risk associated with serving as a rubber stamp. Aycock paused the proceedings, cancelled the trial, disqualified all 4 lawyers, barred 2 of them from appearing before the court for 2 years, and fined all of them between $1,000 and $3,500. Yes. Tell me where to send this judge a fan letter. Keep up the good work. Next week, we'll conclude the interview with Gašper when he'll introduce us to his whale family, talk about how we know whether translations are correct, what's going on in the neural nets that decode whale language, and the role that generative AI has played, the robots that they use, and whale emotions. That's next week on AI and You. Until then, remember, no matter how much computers learn how to do, it's how we come together as humans that matters.
That's all for this episode of AI and You. Please leave a rating and comment and share with your friends. Get the book Artificial Intelligence and You and see more videos and articles at aiandyou.net. That's aiandyou.net, where you can also send us your questions. Thank you for listening.